Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It is my pleasure and honor to welcome you all to this launch of the Global Index on Openness, the Ghana edition. As Michael has just said, I am the Senior Director at the African Center for Economic Transformation based in Accra. And we're working with the Legatum Institute on basically launching this event. We've been associated with Legatum over the last years, trying to work on some indices to track economic transformation and also openness. So I'm particularly delighted to be here this afternoon to moderate this session. I'm not too sure whether most of you know what Legatum Institute is, but I would like to give you just a short overview of it. That the Legatum Institute's mission is to create global movement of people committed to creating pathways for prosperity and poverty reduction and transforming their societies. To achieve this, over the last 14 years, they have been tracking how prosperity has evolved around the world through their flagship Global Prosperity Index. Truly holistic set of measures that captures the economic prosperity, the institutional strength, and the social well-being of each nation. Over the last 18 months, they have been honing in on some key regions and countries and developing a deeper understanding of the economic robustness of 157 countries around the world. So today, we are here to launch the in-depth case study that has been undertaken on the economic openness of the Ghana's economy. We are excited that you've been able to join us, and we will basically be having a very lively conversation around these issues. So without much ado, I would like to call on Michael to come and make the presentation, and then after that, we'll have some conversation around the issues. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Ed. So, as Ed has laid out, our core analysis, the core work that we do at the Legatum Institute has been around analyzing prosperity and building indexes to measure prosperity around the world, to rank countries, to show them pathways to greater prosperity. And we have, as Ed has indicated, paid particular focus to issues of economic well-being over the last few years, and hence this focused index on economic openness. And I think there's a few copies of the blue document, the overall global index, on the tables. And as part of this, we felt it's all very well creating big spreadsheets, big tables, measuring people in an abstract, data-driven way. But actually, to really understand it, to really tell stories, we wanted to identify a dozen countries where we'd really invest time and energy into getting under the skin of the data and really move from what's going on to why and to how might it change, how might it improve. And hence Ghana as one of the case studies that we're doing, the reason we're here today. Of course, Ghana is an interesting country from a global perspective, as sort of one of the shining beacons of democracy in West Africa, very high recent growth rates, interesting challenges and opportunities coming with the development of of oil, and of course now a secretariat to the African Continental Free Trade Agreement, a real pivotal country in the region as well, looking forward. So why did we look at economic openness, and why do we think it matters? Well, at one level, if we dial back 20 years, few people would be asking this question, few people would be challenging it. There would be the sense that globalization is increasing trade, people's GDPs are rising, countries are lifting many, many members of their population out of poverty. Then the Asian crisis of '98 came along. then the global financial crisis. And a lot of people said, I'm not sure. I'm not sure this economic openness business works. Many countries have increased the barriers on trade, have rethought how foreign investment works, thought about capital controls, etc. And on one level, what we've seen in the debates is a sense of the international openness being the thing that a lot of people talk about. The sense of tariff barriers, the sense of capital controls. But when you dig into what drives the success of an economy, the domestic openness to competition, the domestic openness to new ideas, the domestic openness to capital is as critical, if not more critical, than the international side of the equation. And when thinking about economic openness, therefore, it's as important to make sure that an entrepreneur is able to get access to capital to grow. A business owner is able to compete in a market that traditionally is dominated by state-owned enterprises. That a labor market is flexible and people can hire workers, can adjust terms and conditions to allow them to operate and to make sure that a formalizing of a business is not an encumbrance. So we then focused on this, spent quite a bit of time with a wide range of experts saying, what are the micro foundations of economic openness? What are the very specific policy-related issues that you need to think about in quite a structured way? So let me lay out 4 big themes that we base our economic openness on. The first we call market access and infrastructure. The real fundamental issues of, do I have a communication system that works? Does the transport system work? Can I get reliable access to energy and water? These are just the very beginnings of what you need to have a manufacturing base. And there's a wide range of progress across the world on that basis. So if that's the infrastructure side, market access looks at how easy is it to trade across borders. What's the border administration like? I was talking to Morgan earlier about DHL's experience, bringing stuff into Tema Port. How do you get it out again? How long does it take? What does it cost, for example? What are the import tariff barriers? What are the non-tariff barriers, the regulatory restrictions that may affect it? If you don't have the right labeling, you've got the wrong size socket or whatever, what are those sort of things that affect and inhibit trade? The next level, investment environment. How easy is it to get capital? Are there property rights to protect people's rights in land and intellectual property so that they can be capitalized? Are there investor protections around, say, insolvency and corporate governance? Is there a financing ecosystem in terms of sound banks who are able to give credit, and not just bank credit, but venture capital, private equity, etc.? And is international investment facilitated and enabled as a source not just of money but of capabilities, or is it inhibited with capital controls, ownership requirements, etc.? Then enterprise conditions. We look at how contestable are markets. Are they open to competition? What's the environment for business creation like? That's very much focusing on the area, say, the World Bank Ease of Doing Business looks at. How many steps do I have to take to register a company? What capital is required before I can even start? What's the regulation like? The procedures just simply to run a company in the formal economy. For example, how many times does GRA audit you? What burden is there on that? How light touch is it? And labor market flexibility we talked about. And finally, and this is one that I hope the conversation will move on to, underpinning all that is what's the quality of governance? Is the political economy working? Is the system of democracy providing you with constraints on the executive, political accountability? Is that leading to good rule of law where people can rely on the courts to get fair judgments and enable commerce? Is the government integrity high? Is there corruption or is there transparency? Is the government efficient at doing things? And then what's the regulatory regime like overall? Is it high quality or low? So that's our framework. And what we see is it really relates to the quality of an economy in the long run. There's much more detail in the report, but that's the high level. So we took that and then examined every country in the world on this basis. We use about 40 different data sources from the IMF, the World Bank, the World Economic Forum, etc., to put together a ranking. And here's a sort of snapshot of the ranking. Countries like Hong Kong and Singapore up at the top of the rankings. At one level, no surprise. Countries, if you go even further down this list, you'll see the Yemens and Afghanistans towards the bottom. Ghana, you'll see there at 91, somewhat ahead of neighbors like Cote d'Ivoire and Nigeria. But the ranking is just a calling card. It's just, a number. The really interesting thing and the valuable insights you can get from this is looking at the shape. What do you see about the patterns? Is there an area of a particular economy that's strong? Is there an area that's weak? What does that tell us about what to do, where the pressures are? So, for example, if we look across the scale for Ghana, we see on the left, Ghana's ranked 115th in market access and infrastructure. So when we think about the quality of roads, electricity, water, communications, it's underperforming. Other end of the spectrum, go all the way over to the right, and you see governance at 55. It's a position of strength. Now, I think there are two sides to this. If you are part of the international community, you will often hear of Ghana being lauded as a standout country for governance, particularly in this region of the world. And on many elements it is. Then I've had conversations with a number of you over the last few days. You hear that when you get under the skin of this, a slightly different story, and we'll come on to that. Because there are many aspects of governance. There's the formal aspect of governance. Do we have a constitution? Do I have a bicameral parliament? Do I have quadrennial elections? Do I have a Supreme Court? Do I have judges, etc.? And then there's the nitty-gritty of what's life like on the ground. And that's where we talk about integrity, corruption, transparency, etc. And there the story is a bit different. Now, we find that the reality of this, you need to get down to a bit of detail to really understand the story and to find out what's really going on. But step one, what's been happening to Ghana's economic openness over time? And we see a story of market access and infrastructure getting better. Globally, that is very much on trend. The communication revolution of the last 20 years has had a massive impact on the quality of infrastructure. Electricity is improving, roads are getting better. So there is a steady, solid progress. Investment environment is showing a bit of a different picture. Two issues to worry about there. The quality of investor protections has been declining. Now, it'll be interesting to see the impact of the insolvency law that's just come into force. Will that make a big difference? Hopefully it will, but that's something to watch out for. Also, our measures of restrictions on international investment have also declined and deteriorated. So that's one to really think carefully about. On enterprise conditions, we see two trends that are counteracting each other. Markets are becoming less contestable. Our take, our view of other people's takes as well, is that state-owned enterprises are becoming more dominant in many places, and the market for contracts is getting, again, concentrated, sole source being an issue. And on the other hand, the good news, many aspects of the ease of doing business are getting better. The number of regulations, what it takes to start a business is getting better. Although I think, as many of you have probably spotted in the last couple of weeks, the World Bank Ease of Doing Business report just come out, the latest version, gone down 4 places. So there's another, let's keep this show on the road. Governance, unfortunately, sliding a bit. But if we step back, what we see as the overall trend is modest improvement. In aggregate, it's steadily getting better, but it's slipping back in the rankings. So what we're seeing over the last 10 years is 12 countries have overtaken Ghana in the rankings. So other countries, your peers, are improving faster. Your neighbors, on one side Togo, on the other side Cote d'Ivoire, are catching up. Their improvement in their economic openness has been much greater than Ghana's has over the last 10 years. They're still not in as good a place as you are, collectively, but you need to think about it in terms of these guys are catching up. Now let me unpack governance a little bit, because this for us at one level is sort of the interesting story. There's a massive spread in the quality of different aspects of governance in this country. From the formal aspects, executive constraints, political accountability, rule of law, strong, and very strong for the region, and justifiably so. Where we find the binding constraint, the issue that causes people to ask questions and think what's going on, is around government integrity. The extent to which the World Justice Program and others will call out the level of which people are engaging in corruption for their own gain, the lack of transparency So transparency and corruption are often two sides of the same coin. And again, the interesting thing, the right to information law, passed but yet to come into force, that could be a trigger for a reform in this area. But on the other hand, cynics may say there's a surprising lack of transparency about the right to information law. These are the things at the heart, I think, of what the Ghanaian economy needs to work on, as much as some of the more, not necessarily superficial, but sort of outcome-oriented stuff about, say, roads and electricity, etc. Now, what do we think the potential is? The way we look at this is to say, you could contest all the structures of economic openness that we've laid out, market access, enterprise conditions, etc. But let's get to the heart of what we're trying to achieve, and how would we judge whether the economy is heading in the right direction or not? And that's where we've started to work on a measurement called what we call productive capacity. It's a bit like GDP per capita, but there's some important adjustments and deviations from it that try to get to the underlying value of what's going on in the economy. So the first thing we do is we say resource rents, i.e. the royalties from minerals, mining, from oil, pumping, etc. That's fundamentally an accounting treatment. Now, it's income, it's real income, so I'm not suggesting it isn't of value. But in terms of judging the economy, what has been produced, that has been produced from a well into a bank account. The extraction is the value-adding bit, as opposed to the sale of the barrel of oil. The second is to say, when we're thinking about an economy, as opposed to thinking about a society, the group of people we want to, in effect, divide that value by is the working age population. Who is available to generate wealth? Who can be part of a productive economy? It's the working age population. It's not the entire population. So to work out how good is the economy at generating wealth from the underlying talent base, we need to think about who that underlying talent base is. There's another issue about how skilled it is, but first up, let's get the number of people who could contribute right. Now, why is this important? Because when you're looking internationally, there's nearly a 2x range between, say, Kuwait, where 80-something% of the population is working age. So they should be able to produce a huge amount, versus, say, a Mali or a Niger, not far from here, where the working age population is only around 40-something%. So that makes a big difference to what you should expect to produce. Now, when we look at that with Ghana, what we see is Ghana's productive capacity has risen 3.7% per annum, while its GDP per capita has gone up by 4.3%. That gap's important, because what it's saying is, if you look at your national accounts, you're getting a slightly rosier picture than what we think is structurally underlying happening. Because oil rents have increased, and that's good news, but it's sort of like free money at one level, and that encourages a rentier economy, which we'll come back to. The other is the working age population has got bigger as a proportion of the overall population, so you should be producing more per head of population, but you've got more people of the right age to do it. The other thing is, that's actually quite surprising, and we'll come on to this. What we're seeing is that the group of countries that are achieving those growth rates, which are pretty good growth rates, generally are transforming their economies and increasing their economic openness at a much faster rate than Ghana is. So what I would be saying as an observer here is, I'm concerned that the structural basis to persist with this admirable growth rate is about to slow down. Other countries are increasing their economic openness at 4 times the rate of Ghana. Those are producing the same growth, outcome growth rates. So you're running into a position, I think, that you're going to have some real transformation. Now, why do I go on about economic openness and productive capacity? Because what we see is a very high correlation between these two. And what we also see, that's the one level, cross-country analyses are easy, and we could sort of say you can put annual regression together. The true test is, if we look over a time period, we're also seeing that over the last 10 years, countries that increased their economic openness by a range of measures also had higher economic growth rates. So those people who are improving their infrastructure faster, who are improving their investment conditions faster, who are strengthening their governance faster, their output is growing at a faster rate. And this is why we will be saying we think there's a real agenda for Ghana to work seriously on its economic openness so that they get back to the point that the economic openness is improving at the rate at which you also want your GDP to improve. So what's a target then? How might we set up a target for Ghana? Let me just try and get this. Here we go. So what we've said is let's look across all the elements of economic openness. Property, so investor protection, we look at property rights, we look at contract enforcement, et cetera, and say, what's the African best practice? That gives us a target to aim for. And if we do that across all our 4 pillars, investment environment, enterprise conditions, market access to infrastructure, governance, we can get a sense of, okay, that's a goal that's worth achieving. And we know that, at least on the African continent, 5 other countries are already achieving that goal. So take that as a benchmark. This is not an unattainable benchmark on every single one of these dimensions. So where does that place us? Well, let's go back to what the progress has been like. This has been the economic openness improvement of Ghana over the last 10 years, up 1.2, 1.3 points. If you wanted to achieve, in say 15 years, the African, what we sort of call the African benchmark, you would need to do something like that. Now, it feels like a bit like a hockey stick. And I see Emmanuel laughing here, joking. It's not going to happen, impossible. That would take you to the equivalent of Romania today. But it's perfectly possible. And let me show you why I'd argue it's perfectly possible. Others have done it. India, for the first 5 years, that early 10-year period, was progressing along a very similar trajectory to Ghana. Then the Modi government came in and made a difference. Look at that. Okay? So what we have here is a country whose level of economic openness, so structural base of the economy, policy patterns, etc. Boy, they've got corruption. I mean, we were there 6 weeks ago. They've got issues about their tariffs. They've got issues about their transport as well. This is not, miles apart. But a very deliberate decision was taken to change the structure of the economy. And you can just see it in the graph there. And look, that trajectory is even steeper than a 15-year target for Ghana. That's why I'd say this can be done. It takes a mindset, it takes focus, it takes deliberate effort, but it's not beyond the bounds of reality. We have an example. And if that can be done, that could move Ghana. The red arrow there on the right shows you what could happen. And we believe that could give you a doubling in the GDP per capita, doubling in the productive capacity over 5 years, a 5% per annum growth rate, eminently achievable. But what we're seeing is the countries that achieve those levels of growth rates are managing the underlying structural transformation of the economy. They are changing their policies. They're investing in infrastructure. They're not progressing at a 1.3 over 10 years. So the question then is, what does it take to allow the Ghanaian economy to make those changes? Because interestingly, we've been here for a week. We've had lots of great conversations this week based on interviews we've done in the past. And I'm not hearing anybody argue, maybe the panel is going to come up and tell me otherwise, I'm not hearing anybody arguing saying that these are bad ideas, this is the wrong thing to do. But what I'm hearing in discussion is that it's very difficult to do it. So what needs to be done? If we look then at sort of Ghana today versus the benchmark, where do the big changes need to happen? And what we see as a big element is in market access infrastructure. So that comes back to roads, electricity, water, and to an extent the trading arrangements. Quite a bit in investment environment. Now, less in governance if you think that we've got the right benchmark for governance. And I think then there's an interesting bigger question. Things like infrastructure take a long, long time to develop, and they're context dependent. Therefore, coming up with an OECD benchmark for infrastructure is not a helpful thing to do. But taking an African benchmark is plausible and realistic. On governance, I think for transformation, we need to aim higher, and we'll come back to that. So with that, then, four challenges and opportunities. I'll go through these quite quickly because I think, in reality, the governance question and the panel will bring out more things to talk about. Infrastructure first. Let's look at where we are versus that benchmark. Electricity outages, the data from the World Bank that we've got is probably a few years out of date, so I would say, given what's happened with the work on dump store, et cetera, I'd say you're probably closer to the benchmark than you might otherwise be seen on that. Road quality needs to improve. Seaport services need to improve. What also is fascinating, was a survey that we saw where people were asked, what's the most important thing to sort out? And, quite uniquely, infrastructure came up as being more important than unemployment. In nearly every country around the world, you ask those sort of questions, unemployment typically comes up very, very high. For all the obvious reasons, that's a very direct personal issue that affects people's lives. Interestingly, infrastructure, clearly important. Now, clearly also recognized in the recent budget as well. So that, again, it's not that this is not on people's minds. But I think it's worth reflecting on, how do you turn that agenda into something real? First, where is the infrastructure being focused? Is it being focused on growth-focused areas? Is it being developed and prioritized with an economic development mindset or not? Question mark. Is there enough going into serving the digital economy as well as the physical economy? There's an interesting balance there. But in the world going forward, if you start with relatively weak infrastructure, India is a classic version of this. Do a bit of leapfrogging, make sure your digital infrastructure works so that you can have more of a service-led economy and you're not reliant on the physical transport. Deeper down in the heart of this, how is the PPP structure working out? Is it really producing competitive tenders? Are you really getting best value for money? And then are those projects being monitored and managed? Kenya's done a lot of work in this space, and I think one could argue there's some benchmarking that could be done there. And then finally, and this is particularly relevant for the electricity, is the transfer pricing, is the economic system, the price signaling across the value chain set up to create the right answers? And it just seems, certainly in electricity, but also in other areas, that that's a challenge. On trade across borders, the next big part of market access and infrastructure, I think, impressive improvements over time for speeding up the processing at the ports. So that's a really good example of where focus effort on many fronts has, over a multi-year period, produced improvements. What's left to be done, though, seems to be mostly on the cost side. So the cost of getting stuff through the ports seems to be where the issues, and I know there have been debates about the charges that have been coming in recently. But that definitely seems to be a place where there's a competitive disadvantage. And then on import tariffs, at the moment, this is looking like a challenge. And I think what the real opportunity is to say, in a world where the Continental Free Trade Agreement is coming in, where Accra is going to be hosting the Secretariat, to what extent can the Ghanaian polity here be a productive force for making sure that as tariffs get aligned, as everything gets harmonized, it gets harmonized into a sort of pro-trade, pro-movement of goods, anti-protectionist perspective. And I think that's one of the really interesting challenges and opportunities going forward, is how do you create those the right pressures on the system so that the sort of anti-protectionist, pro-commerce, pro-recognizing that actually if you go high, particularly in a bigger trading area, tariffs may be high over here to protect something in Kenya, high over here to protect something in Uganda, high over here to protect something in Botswana. As a result, they hit a lot of other people. Now, access to capital is one that we looked at and we said, interesting. And actually, I think as the more we've dug into this, the more we sense, okay, getting capital is a two-way system. You have to have investable propositions and you have to have finance. Perhaps one of the issues at the moment is that when we look at the challenge with SMEs, is the propositions themselves may not be investable, in the sense that if there's not enough formula formalization of the economy, if people don't have audited accounts, you're going to end up relying on collateral. And there's a very heavy reliance on collateral because people can't easily demonstrate in a trustworthy way the business opportunities they have and the track record they have. So our sense there is that, yes, there's probably some work continuing to sort of tidy up the banking system, probably some work to continue bringing in venture capital and regulating the rules so that venture capitalists can see, yes, this is a sensible place, I know what's going to happen. But actually, it's actually creating credit worthiness among SMEs that we think is the biggest challenge. How do you accelerate their capability building? How do you provide support? How do you help the formalization process such that when the growth opportunity occurs, you've got a track record of accounts, you're able to go to the bank and say, look, this is my business plan, I don't need to give you a whole lot of collateral, my business plan is your collateral. Foreign investment, I think, is the other one where, we would be calling out a bit of a warning sign. It seems to be getting tougher. Local content rules around oil and gas, have been sort of causing some issues. Capital requirements to set up a business are not reflective of the new economy. So in a world where you had big companies, heavy asset bases, having large capital requirements, could be argued for. In a world where you've got asset-light organizations, digital economy, asking a foreign company to provide a lot of assets which are completely unnecessary for their operations, is an inhibitor. And finally, on the investment environment, good work on digitizing the land registry. I think a lot more work to be done there going forward. Right, let's get to, I think, the more interesting conversation, or at least I think where what we're seeing from our analysis, where the heart of the issue probably lies. First up, in terms of governance, I would say that from a point of view of a development agenda, an African benchmark is not sufficient to set a good goal for governance. We need to be thinking much more in terms of, take Southeast Asian nations that have made great progress, but not the paragons of virtue. If you look at Singapore or Korea in particular, these are not paragons of governance virtue, but they are demonstrations of how good governance needs to be in order to allow for sustained high growth rates. And that at one level is sort of, the B- answer to the governance question is where we need to be looking, rather than saying everybody has to be A+. And that's why we think somebody like Korea is a very good benchmark from that point of view. At the moment, I think the analysis of Ghana has often praised the formal aspects of governance, and rightly so. But I think we need to think much more on the operational side, the real-life experiences. The other thing is that when you look at governance, you don't often see it. But when you go downstream, and we see a lot of this when we look at places like Romania and Indonesia, you say, how strong is interpersonal institutional trust? So the Afrobarometer places Ghana very low on interpersonal trust. Institutional trust, not quite so low, but that's a sign there's an issue of governance. Are investors protected? Strong governance will want a uniform application of that. Are markets contestable? Strong governance will allow for that. Are markets distorted? Again, strong governance will prevent that happening. So these for us are the canaries in the coal mine. And we see it in the data. And again, more obviously when you look versus Korea around the use of office or public gain. One of the survey questions, you see that actually Ghana, from an African Union benchmark point of view, not far off the benchmark. From a South Korea point of view, that's where we need to be thinking. Likewise, in terms of right to information. Also, government effectiveness. But I think let's pause and think, what do we think the issue is? I think the first one is shifting to a developmental rather than distributional mindset. I think one of the great things about oil is the income it provides. One of the challenges is it starts to create a sense within the polity of how does that money get distributed and used? It becomes about using resources rather than generating wealth. I think on the government policy, a big government, in terms of hundreds of ministers or 100+ ministers, means that focus on binding constraints is very hard. You've got a lot of people who have a particular area of responsibility wanting to get action. And we were at the Imani I manifesto yesterday, and to hear about 500 campaign promises. Where's the priority? And I think, really working hard on what are the binding constraints to development? What are the most important things to work on? And then single-mindedly focusing on them, delivering them, I think, could really help. And we were up at the, in the Volta region of the Accra Dam on Monday, and, I was looking up at the president's villa, and I was thinking, here is somebody who had a single-minded focus. I mean, you can argue whether it's the right or wrong focus and how we set it up, but that was a big, big focus. And that villa, that was a monitoring and review process. He personally was checking on this. And I think one of the issues is if you've got so many things happening, it's really hard to make sure that everything gets delivered well. And a great example I think is worth looking at is what the Malaysians did with their PEMANDU, which is a sort of program management office, which reported into the president and really worked hard on focus and working cross-administration. So you had an institution whose job was the development of the economy and the society, who took policy direction from the government, but really focused on delivery over the medium term. I think, okay, so what's going to allow that to happen? I think we need to think about campaign finance and transparency of expenditure. The whole transparency agenda, I think, is going to be critical to this. And then, a form of cultural transformation. We had a conversation yesterday about the private sector and how you sort of nearly need to split the private sector into two bits. There's the private sector that serves government contracts, and then there's the truly private sector that's serving the market, serving customers, and faces real competition. That's the group that we need to be listening to. That's the group that we need to give a voice to. And changing their relative importance in the economy is going to be critical. So, to conclude, questions that I'd love to, as we bring the panel up, get some thoughts on. If we look at the evolutionary approach we're seeing to economic openness here, is that going to suffice? Do we need to think about a fully fledged transformation? And to do that, do we need to reset the social contract? Is there a social contract issue that needs to get sorted out first before you can really allow these policies to move forward? And with that, I'll ask Ed to come back up and moderate the panel.